Hi there. This is a video of clips which I used in the course of my research for my book Retreat. And the theme of these particular selection of clips is Buddhism and the Beatniks, which goes together quite well. The first clip is quite an extended one, and it's from an interview or a presentation that Allen Ginsberg gave in 1993 on the subject of Buddhism and the Beats. And I've clipped it down a bit and introduced some visual imagery, but it's essentially an interview by the director Robin Brentano that is available on YouTube. But I think hopefully this slightly truncated version will be instructive. I think from my perspective, what's most revelatory about this particular clip is the way that Ginsberg views psychedelic drugs, mental health issues, and spirituality as being completely interlocked. If there was one clip that most perfectly illustrated the concepts behind my book, this would be it.
Kerouac was interested in mortality because he had seen his brother die when he was very young and had sat with his father as his father died, and his best friend from high school died in World War II. So Kerouac had experienced both dukkha and transitoriness very early and was already ripe for some kind of renunciation of the world, in a sense, or acceptance of a world of suffering, whichever way you want to look at it. And our friend Cassidy, around 1948, became involved with Edgar Cayce and the Association for Research and Enlightenment in Virginia Beach, pretty well known as sort of a mythical American spiritualist. And Cassidy was a very intelligent guy, a man of whom I was speaking just before, who were having a celebration for his birthday, the late Neil Cassidy. So Cassidy got really interested, and Cassidy had been in Cayce and notions of reincarnation. And Cassidy had been, for Kerouac, the prototypical model for the character of Dean Moriarty in On the Road, and Cody Pomeroy in a later book, Visions of Cody, which are among Kerouac's best books, best early lyric books. So Kerouac went out to San Francisco and stayed with him in San Jose, actually. And he wrote me that Cassidy was like Billy Sunday with a suit, some kind of provincial American hustler, hustling Casey ideas. So Kerouac went to the San Jose Public Library to look at the Himalayan origin of those ideas, and found a book by Dwight Goddard called A Buddhist Bible, which has pretty reasonable translations of Surangama Sutra, Lankavatara Sutra fragments, Prajnaparamita, Highest Perfect Wisdom, Milarepa stories, Vinaya rules, some Hinayana, some Mahayana, and some Vajrayana texts. And Kerouac got really involved because he recognized the suffering, the dukkha aspect of the three marks of existence immediately, and wrote me about it. But finally, when he came back from San Francisco, he crooned me a very beautiful melody and words, which really turned me on, which was a almost Frank Sinatra version of The Refuges. Really intrigued me or moved me. It sounded like some ancient Lead Belly blues. Lead Belly, you know, the blues singer.
Which year was that, Alex?
That would be 1950-51. Around the same year that, having read Aldous Huxley's Doors of Perception, I tried some peyote, which was on sale in a storefront on East 10th Street and 2nd Avenue. Great baskets of it are displayed legally in the storefront. From Magic Gardens, Laredo, Texas. So there was the introduction also of the psychedelic catalyst, which was of interest, although by 1948 I had a sort of natural event of mine that opened me up somewhat, which was an auditory hallucination of hearing Blake's voice reciting the Sunflower, and some sense of vastation of consciousness, or oceanic feelings as Freud calls them, or a sense of the infinite accommodating spaciousness of the sky itself, or above the roofs of Harlem, actually, looking out of a window, looking out above the roofs of Harlem. I didn't have any kind of language to deal with that, except at the time I was reading St. John of the Cross and Plato's Phaedrus and some Western Gnostic materials, so I got it all mixed up with monotheistic language. And within about a year and a half or two, I wound up in the bug house for about 8 months. And I was nuts, but it was needed someone who spoke my nutty language to give me some dharma, actually. And at that time, around that time, Suzuki Roshi was teaching at Columbia College, and John Cage and others were visiting, but I didn't hear about it. I was in that neighborhood. So I had a few episodes of this kind of breakthrough a few times, but as well as the sort of heavenly or vast, there was also the terrific and horrific aspect of it. As Huxley describes in Heaven and Hell, there were a few moments where my sort of creepy crawly looking into the sky and realizing it was going to come down someday and eat me up, and I was going to disappear and die. So that was the ground to which Kerouac was writing Buddham Saranam Gacchami, or existence is suffering, transitoriness, anatma, no permanent self. Then began looking at Suzuki Roshi's manual of Zen Buddhism with his pictures of the 10 bulls, the 10 ox herding pictures. Does anybody know that? A few, yeah. Showing a young man catching a glimpse of the ox's ass, or footprints, and then his ass, and then chasing after him, and finally grabbing him and leading him by the nose, and finally sitting on him, and finally directing him sitting, and then finally sitting up there, casually playing a flute, ox and man becoming friends, and then finally the mysterious one, a circle where there was nothing inside, like a big empty shunyata circle, and then a branch flowering, and then the last picture is this old guy, the same guy but now old and with a big belly and a big sack on his back full of goodies for the rest of mankind, coming down from the mountain to give out his dharmic wisdom delights. And that always intrigued me. And around the same time, somehow I was intrigued by the Tibetan Book of the Dead, particularly by the pictures and the horrific deities, because it reminded me of the horrific aspects that I'd seen with William Blake, who has somewhat of a similar imagination pictorially. Well, in the late 50s I had some bum trips on acid, and kept coming to the horrific aspect, the death trip, and couldn't get beyond that. Because I was always wanting to get to heaven and see my eternity again, just like in the Blake vision, and grasping for that, and failing to get that, I decided I must be the worst person in the world and the biggest sinner, and I must therefore be in hell, and well, immediately hell would rise around me since I was high on acid. Especially high on acid in an Army-conducted test in Stanford University in 1958, with electrodes stuck into my head and encephalographs and everything like that, taking my body temperature and heartbeat and respiration, and white walls in the laboratory like a rat, with a distinct feeling that Big Brother was listening in on me, which turned out to be true, since they were LSD experiments sponsored by the CIA and the Army ultimately. And by the time in late 62, early 63, I got to India and spoke to Dujim Rinpoche. He had a much more interesting sword to cut through the Gordian knot of my intellectual paradox. When I told him my story, like the ancient mariner going around with his albatross on his neck, telling his story. I heard Blake's voice and I got scared and I don't know what I'm doing. And when I take acid, I get scared and I get on a bum trip. What am I going to do? He's in sympathy, and said, "Oh, some of our monks have these experiences from meditation." And he said, "If you see something beautiful, No, if you see something horrible, don't cling to it. And if you see something beautiful, don't cling to it. And that was absolutely exactly right on the precise point, perfect. So in India, I went on a Buddhist pilgrimage with Gary Snyder. We went to Sanchi, Ajanta, Ellora, Khajuraho, then went to Dharamsala and visited the Dalai Lama with Gary Snyder, who was more officially there, and so, as a Buddhist, so listened to their conversation. But also talked about LSD there. And the Dalai Lama said, could I see what was inside a briefcase? And I said, well, yes, because it's empty. And Gary kicked me and said, oh, shut up, stop playing verbal jokes. We're talking seriously. From India, I went on to Japan and sat with Gary Snyder in Daitokaji Monastery for a short session and stayed 6 weeks. But somehow it never rubbed off. And for some reason or other, Snyder, who knew Zazen, sitting practice, never told me, or Kerouac. And this year I finally asked Snyder, how come you were already sitting, you never told me or Kerouac or anyone around? And he said, well, you know, I thought, first of all, in those days, Buddhism was much more formalistic and not quite so open and not quite so bohemian, and I thought maybe this was forcing it on you, so to speak, and you shouldn't really tell anybody about it unless you're asked 3 times. Well, how can you know to ask if you don't know what to ask for? I certainly would have taken to it like a duck to water if I had known what just simple shamatha vipassana was. And it just so happens that I never ran into anybody who just sat me down and said, well, why don't you sit on your ass and pay attention to your breathing. And just the beginning thing, just something really simple. Snyder, I think, thought that was too mysteriously oriental for the Western mind. So he was timid in exposition. However, I did have a good experience on acid in 1967, where I finally gave up trying to get to heaven or hell, and just sat there breathing, and it was the first time I'd not had a bum trip in a long time. And wrote a very good poem called Whale's Visitation, which is coherent both as an acid record and as a record of a nature poem. By 1970, I ran into Swami Muktananda Paramahamsa through Ramdas. Ramdas I had known since 1960, and actually I taught him some of the mantras that I learned in India. And when I came back from India in '63, I began singing quite a bit, whether Hare Krishna or Hare Om Namo Shivaya or Om Shri Maitreya or Gati Gati or Om Mani Padme Hum, just sort of singing them. And I ran into Muktananda, who's a Swami, pretty good, interesting late Swami, who actually I think is descended from the same lineage, or similar parallel lineage of the 80 Mahasiddhas. That branch of Hinduism has some common thing with Tilopa and the others. And I think at Ramdas, it was a meeting with Ramdas at a church, Ramdas, Muktananda, and Satchidananda. And Satchidananda I had known since I had visited his teacher, Shivananda, and taken some lessons in Hatha Yoga in '61, too. They were all 3 of them together, so I went up and said hello to Ramdas, and he introduced me to Satchidananda, who invited me at 6 a.m. the next day to visit his morning readings. And when I went there the next day, he said, do you have any meditation practice? And I said, no, I don't. And he said, well, why don't you get a plane and come down with me to Dallas this weekend, and I'll teach you a meditation practice. And having an American Express card and nothing to do, I actually did that. And, but I thought he was going to sort of exploit me as his famous poet mascot to a group in Dallas. But instead he said, you have a hotel room. He gave me instruction for just sitting with a mantra on my breath, silently at the heart level. He said, why don't you go to your room and sit there and do that all day, and I'll come in every once in a while. So I did, and boy, was I relieved I didn't have to do anything. I could just sit in my room and breathe. Because I was already overworked. And then I met Trungpa Rinpoche on a street corner almost the same year with his friend hailing a cab. So I stepped up and said, "May I steal your vehicle?" Which is a funny pun, not knowing who he was. And he said, "Of course." Yes, and his friend said, "Are you Allen Ginsberg?" And I said, "Yes." He said, "This is Chögyam Trungpa Rinpoche." And I said, "Well, this is my father, Louis Ginsberg. Om Ahom Vajra Guru Padma Siddhi Hum," which was a mantra I had learned a week before from via Gary Snyder. And so we founded in 1974 the Jack Kerouac School of Disembodied Poetics at Boulder, Colorado. Because one day I had read him all of Kerouac's Mexico City Blues, a Buddhist-inspired set of verses, 240 poems, on a 5-hour auto ride down from Tail of the Tiger, now Carmacholing in Vermont, to New York. And he laughed all the way through, including the line, "Anger doesn't like to be reminded of fits," which is Kerouac. A great book of poems. And when we got out, he said, "It's a great manifestation of mind."
I always find that a very remarkable clip, especially because so late in his life, Ginsberg really understands the philosophical ideas of Buddhism and is able to bring that knowledge in depth to his understanding of his own activities and his behaviour in the past. Here's a great clip of which follows on quite neatly of Ginsberg actually now or then at Naropa, and you can see in the audience asking the very kind of regally presented Chogyam Trungpa, a very problematic figure in fact, asking him a question from the audience about rock and roll, which is neatly ties in with the whole countercultural theme. And the second clip is one showing, I think, well, probably most likely, Trungpa very drunk and answering questions out of his head to the audience in Naropa. So I think that's very interesting as well, to actually see Trungpa in action.
Alan,
Do you relate to American jazz, blues, rock and roll as having possibilities?
maybe jazz has more possibilities, blues have more possibilities, but rock and roll has lesser possibilities.
And why do you feel that?
Well, it is a question of actually indulging individuals' sense perceptions. It is too Coca-Cola oriented.
Well, I think, have you had the experience of, say, majesty and calm and centeredness in any rock and roll that you've heard?
Unfortunately not. I tried, it was very hard, Alan. I tried very hard. I thought at some point I was missing something.
Yeah.
But it turned out to be I wasn't missing anything at all.
You use the word inaccessible in referring to Vajrayana teachings, and what was the implication there?
Well, it's very rare. And therefore you probably don't get it. Like if you order steak tartare, very few people order such a dish, and usually somebody order hamburger, hot dog. And steak tartare is very rare.
We've already heard how Ginsberg was fascinated with Tibetan Buddhism. Obviously, Trungpa himself came from the Vajrayana, which is the Tibetan strain of Mahayana Buddhism. I think it's interesting to reflect on the key importance of Tibet and Tibetan Buddhism particularly at this juncture in the counterculture. It had a kind of a particularly sort of burnished sheen. And to that end, I'd like to sort of present a couple more clips which relate specifically to Tibetan Buddhism. The first clip is from the ravishing documentary Requiem for a Faith, which is put together by the professor of comparative religions, Huston Smith, who was a very sort of key figure on the edges of the counterculture, and also sort of lurking behind the scenes essentially at Esalen as well. The second clip is an interview with the German Ernst Hoffmann, who became known as Lama Govinda. He was a sort of a seeker of the East from a previous generation, but he was greatly picked up in the hippie era, and whenever any of the sort of hippie luminaries visited India, they would pay him a call. Timothy Leary spent quite a long time in his company. The clip is from an absolutely beautiful documentary called Sunseed, which features interviews from a number of these key guru figures of the 60s. And I strongly encourage you to go and seek that out and watch the whole thing, which is really fantastic.
Tibet is no more. The land remains, of course, and people continue to live there. But Tibet was more than a land with people. It was a land where life and outlook were shaped by a tradition so strange, so powerful, that it captured the imagination of the world. With the Chinese invasion of 1951, that tradition, centering in Tibetan Buddhism, its religion, was snapped. The Tibetans assume that truth has many levels. Those whose minds are simple will see good and evil as residing outside themselves and possessing concrete forms. Saviors that can rescue us, evil spirits that can do us in. The wise know better. The Tibetan wise knew, and to the advance they taught, that it's all within ourselves. These gods that seem so solid, so objectively real, actually represent our own psychic forces, the calm and fear, the kindness and malevolence that is in each one of us. Moreover, though the images seem so different, some angelic, some fiendish, they actually represent the same reality, the only reality there is. Seen as fearful by those who have much to fear, and as beneficent by those who have won through to serenity. Tibet is no more. Something of her has trickled out and become a part of the world at large. We have her books. and Western students are gleaning what can be learned from refugees. But books and a handful of refugees don't make a living faith. It would be a moment to mourn if Tibetan Buddhism didn't itself teach that life and death are two sides of the same coin, as are the alternative religions of man. The deepest insights of Tibetan Buddhism are not foreign to any of them. On meeting a stranger from abroad, Tibetans used to ask, "To which sublime tradition, revered sir, do you belong?"
What would you recommend to the young people in America in terms of a practice and a method of attaining enlightenment?
Well, I think we have to first to start on a simpler level. That means let us not already think of enlightenment. Let us first of all think of our peace of mind, peace of heart, of our loving attitude towards others. It means to all these simple foundations, you know. Enlightenment, if people start with the idea of enlightenment, I'm afraid not that they aim too high, but they should first make the first steps before they aim at the very summit. Certainly the idea and the ideal of enlightenment should be at the back of their mind. I don't say no. But people who set out to achieve something, you know, that very idea of achievement, which is in America very strong, that is a strengthening of ego. And we should rather be receptive, like a vessel that receives the divine power of the universe, which is also within us, you see.
I think it's useful to actually think of Lama Govinda as a kind of a beatnik. And here's more beatnik stuff. This is the car crash interview that Jack Kerouac was subjected to by the Firing Line host William Buckley. And straight after it is Ginsberg's debriefing 20 years later of that same interview. I think it's nice to see them back to back.
The topic tonight is the hippies, an understanding of whom we must, I guess, acquire or die painfully. We certainly should make considerable progress in the next hour because we have with us a professional student of the hippies, as also someone who is said to have started the whole Beat Generation business, and finally a hippie type who can correct us ever so gently, please, if we are wrong. Mr. Louis Jablonski is a sociologist who studied at Rutgers and took his doctorate at New York University and teaches at San Fernando State College in California, where he is chairman of his department. His first book, which focused on teenage gang life and drug addiction, prepared him for his magnum opus, which is called The Hippie Trip, a first-hand account of the beliefs and behavior of hippies in America. Mr. Jack Kerouac over here became famous when his book On the Road was published. It seemed to be preaching a life of disengagement, making a virtue out of restlessness. The irony is that when the book was belatedly published in 1958, 7 years after it was written, Mr. Kerouac had fought his way out of the Beat Generation and is now, if not exactly orthodox, at least a regular practicing novelist whose 13th book, The Vanity of Doulos, is widely regarded as his best. Mr. Ed Sanders is a musician, a poet, and a polemicist. He is one of the Fugs, a widely patronized combo. He has published 4 books of poetry and has vigorously preached pacifism for a number of years.
generally using psychedelic drugs, and then there's a whole cadre of individuals whom I've termed novices, who are attempting to achieve a certain transcendental state. Then there's a lot of teeny bopper kids who are sort of hanging on. Then there's some ancient folks like Kerouac here who... Why couldn't you keep quiet while I was talking? I'll keep quiet when you talk.
Yeah, yes, that's fair enough, isn't it?
What?
I think that's fair enough, your
You
request.
said cadre, it's cadre.
Well, I'm sorry,
Spanish
I
word.
apologize.
Right.
My semantics aren't...
And I showed my thumbs down to Ginsberg over there in the back.
Oh, he's a nice fella.
Yeah, we'll throw him to the lions.
Well, what about it, Mr. Kerouac? Your exercise about something, or by something.
Restless is true. You had the right word, restless is right.
Well, what is it that that in your judgment distinguishes the hippie movement from, for instance, or simply a routine
Get your
radical
question over
political
with.
movement?
No, I interrupted your sentence. Sentence.
Yeah, I say what distinguishes the hippie movement from simply an orthodox radical, say,
nothing.
Adamite movement?
Adamite?
There was a
Adam, Adam and Eve, or atom?
Adam. As in Adam and Eve.
What's an Adam and Eve? What's Adamite? Where they all wear their hair long, layers, in caves?
Yeah, and sort of back to nature, and
well, that's all right.
Exclusive concern for
You might have
own
to, in due time,
pleasure.
after the Adamite bomb.
Hey, that was good, wasn't it?
Good all the time, boy.
Give that man a drink. Now, Jack, Mr. Kerouac, what I want to ask is this. To what extent do you believe that the Beat generation is related to the hippies?
Oh,
what do they have in common? Was this an evolution from the one to the other?
It's just the older ones.
Yeah.
See, I'm 46 years old. These kids are 18. It's the same movement, which is apparently some kind of Dionysian movement in late civilization, and which I did not intend any more than I suppose Dionysius did, or whatever his name was. But although I'm not Dionysius the Areopagite, I should have been.
Yeah, that's the point, yeah.
Jack thought he was going to have this big, intelligent conversation with Buckley. We got there, came down in a cab or something. Who do we meet on the sidewalk but Ed Sanders? What's Ed doing there? Ed's supposed to be on the show. So we went up the elevator with Ed, and Kerouac said, I don't know you. And why are you on the show? Why are they putting hippie beatniks on the show? And Ed said, but Jack, I'm you're responsible for me. I came out of you're on the road, or I came out of your art. I'm your child, or I'm your second generation. You're my father. And Jack was being, but really sort of ugly drunk, disgruntled. Normally, when I went on the program, I went on one-to-one with Buckley. And someone of Jack's stature, I would have imagined, had gone on one-to-one. Instead, he was set up on a panel with a young beatnik, Ed Sanders, and some guy who's a professor of sociology, who's going to examine him as a specimen or something.
Ginsberg and Kerouac obviously were great material for my book. Burroughs, who was interested in Reich's ideas, a little bit less so, not terribly concerned about wellness or those kind of ideas. However, very interesting was the case of Neal Cassady. And here's some amazing footage of Cassady. The first clip is from a documentary that came out in the 90s called Tripping, which is about Ken Kesey and his adventures in the bus further with the Merry Pranksters. Hunter S. Thompson's opinions in the clip are, I think, particularly incisive on the subject of mental illness and Cassady, and indeed on a kind of existential level on mental illness's place in society. And the second clip is some newsreel footage of Cassady being interviewed, and he goes off on this extraordinary kind of what's described by psychoanalysts as word salad, which is the sort of schizophrenic's kind of ramble talk. But what's so unnerving about it is the way in which he is so seemingly clear-headed at the same time. And so it's it's an interesting and very challenging bit of footage.
And you know that little flick you give the wrist there at about 108 or whatever you can manage to full bore as you dare, or something like that. You know, in Thailand blew his cool there. He went to reverse backward on the gear shift and all. Actually, he's lost.
Cassidy was the main tillerman. He was the driver. He held the helm.
Neal Cassidy was the inspiration for Allen Ginsberg and other writers from the 50s literary movement known as the Beats, which was heavily influenced by the post-war European existentialists. The Bible of the Beats was Jack Kerouac's 1957 instant classic, On the Road. The novel's hero was the fast-talking Zen driver Dean Moriarty, who was drawn straight from real life, from the pivotal character of the Beat crowd, the charismatic Neal Cassidy. 15 years after his on-the-road trips with Kerouac, Neal Cassidy signed on to drive the pranksters bus further.
This is a guy that knows what he's doing, and this is his medium. It's words, it's cars, and it's drugs, but mostly it's the expansion of the consciousness.
He developed a place with Kesey, and what were normally unacceptable psychotic episodes were, in the Kesey, in the context of that the prankster crowd, it was perfectly acceptable behavior.
Sir, these drugs, they're smoking something down here, sir, and it's making me awful fuzzy. Sir, I request permission to sit down.
When attention went away from him, always objected to that. There's this picture of Cassidy driving the bus, and at one point gets up, just sets the throttle, sets the wheel the way he wants to go, comes way back into the bus, and he's talking and coming along and kicking stuff. Everybody's just kind of sitting there, oh, look, Cassidy's not at the driver's seat.
And even though it was an open book exam, some were failures at the acid test.
Mike, then, being the Lord of the Way, not the way, you understand, but St. Mike, since we had the war in the heavens, the significance of these dangerous drugs, to see if you pass the test of don't flip if you can't fly. We're going to see if the endocrine gland system is bigger than man, or is it man and the Sabbath then? But when I say to the $250,000 mansion parents, so-and-so's okay as he's in the other room shooting something in his arm, but all three of them hear me saying that he's not okay, that he is okay, he's got to graduate and prove to me that he's okay, right?
So I hope you enjoyed that short clip, and do please check out the other 7 clips in the playlist. And if you're so inclined, buy yourself a copy of my book, Retreat, and there'll be a description in the description below where you can buy it on Amazon.